What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Something important may be changing across several layers of the Russia-Ukraine war at the same time, and today's briefing is really about how these stories all connect together. On one side, Sergei Shoigu is now openly saying that no region of Russia can feel safe from Ukrainian drones, after Russian officials reported sabotage incidents rose 40% in 2025 to 1,830. And then the Russian Defense Ministry claimed it shot down 421 Ukrainian drones just in the last 24 hours alone. On the other side, the battlefield picture is becoming more complicated than Moscow's victory narrative, because the Institute for the Study of War says continued Ukrainian advances in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast are likely constraining Russian offensive operations, while Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Ukrainian counterattacks have disrupted Russia's March offensive plans. I mean, we are right now halfway past and we don't see anything. Above all of that, a wider geopolitical layer is forming, where the Iran war is lifting oil prices, easing pressure on the Russia's economy, and forcing European leaders like Keir Starmer, Kaja, Kallas, and Alexander Stubb to warn that Ukraine cannot be pushed into the background. So today, let's walk through the battlefield, the drone war inside Russia, Ukraine's air defense innovation, the diplomatic push in London, Europe's pipeline and sanctions fight, Turkey's renewed role, and finally the energy revenues that still keep Russia's war machine running. Because once you put all these stories together, the war looks less like a series of just isolated at random events, and more like a struggle over adaptation, money, and attention. Let's start with the brief Frontline update, because this is where every briefing begins and also where the official narratives are starting to run into a more stubborn reality. So, the March 16th assessment from the Institute for the Study of War says continued Ukrainian advances in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast are likely constraining Russian offensive operations. That wording matters because it does not claim some giant reversal, but it does suggest that Russia's push is facing enough resistance that the simple story of non-stop Russian momentum no longer explains everything. AP media reinforced that point by reporting that Zelenskyy said on Monday that Ukrainian counterattacks in the east and the south had wrecked Moscow's plan for a March offensive. The important detail here is not that Ukraine has suddenly solved every single battlefield problem. No, it clearly has not. Unfortunately, not yet. The point is that Russian gains are not automatically translating into smooth operational momentum. If Ukrainian local counterattacks are forcing Russian units to slow down, relocate, and respond instead of simply dictating the pace, then that changes the meaning of this phase of the war entirely. And that matters, because when battlefield outcomes become less clear, governments fight harder in the informational space. Moscow, for example, emphasizes every single settlement, every single advance, talks about villages getting captured with like 10 residents. Kyiv, on the other hand, emphasizes every successful counterattack and every sign that Russia is burning resources faster than it can comfortably replace them. The real question is not which side produces the louder narrative, but which side is shaping the structure of the next phase of the war. And right now, that looks less like a story of raw territorial statistics and more like a fight over tempo, adaptation, and endurance. And once you look at all at that in that way, the next chapter becomes just way too obvious, because this war is no longer just staying on a single battlefield. Speaking about the battlefield, there is a very interesting combat video I uploaded to my Patreon. Please go ahead, guys, and watch it if you can. The link is down below. Thanks so much. Let's continue. In just a second, I will reveal something most people overlook about Russian official statements. They are often most revealing when they are accidentally exposed anxiety. And Sergei Shoigu, the same one, did exactly that. Reuters reports that Shoigu, now Secretary of Russia's Security Council and a former defense minister, told officials in Yekaterinburg that the pace of Ukrainian drone development means no region of Russia can feel ever safe from the attack. That is not the language of a state that believes distance still protects the interior. That is the language of a state admitting that geometry of the war has changed. Reuters also reports that sabotage attacks against Russia increased by 40% in 2025 to 1,830 incidents, and the number around this statement makes it even more politically significant. The Russian Defense Ministry then said it shot down 421 Ukrainian drones in just last 24 hours alone, while Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin said that the air defenses had repelled the biggest attempted attack on the Russian capital in at least one single year, with 250 drones reportedly downed over the weekend. Even if one assumes some inflation in the official figures, the fact that the Kremlin wants to publicize numbers like this already should tell you something. The scale is large enough that the state now feels the need to reassure the public by talking constantly about interceptions. But reassurance of that kind also spreads the very fear it is supposed to contain, because every Russian hearing those numbers is also hearing the very same message. This is no longer occasional disruption. This is becoming a pattern. For years, a major pillar of wartime stability inside Russia has been the psychological separation between the war zone and ordinary life. Drone warfare chips away at that separation. It affects airports, logistics, infrastructure, and the basic assumption that the rear is still safe. So, when Shoigu says that no region is safe anymore, he's not just describing a military problem, he's acknowledging a political and social one. The Kremlin now has to spend more money protecting infrastructure, more effort managing public perception, and more energy preserving the image of control. So the natural question becomes, not that whether Shoigu survives what he said or not, but another question, what exactly allowed Ukraine to push Russia into admitting this? That takes us straight into one of the most important stories in the war right now. Let's talk about it. This is where things get interesting, because a lot of people still think drone warfare is mostly about range or dramatic footage. But the real strategic question is cost. Who spends more to attack? Who spends more to defend? And who can keep scaling production without exhausting themselves financially? Reuters reporting on the Sting interceptor drone gives one of the clearest answers we have seen in a while. The Ukrainian-made quadcopter, produced by Wild Hornets, has reportedly brought down more than 3,000 Russian Shahid drones since entering regular service in June 2025. Reuters also says that more than 10,000 Sting units roll off the production line each month, and the price per unit is approximately only $2,000 or less, compared to roughly $20,000 to $50,000 for a single Shahid. That math is just strategically brutal. If Ukraine can consistently neutralize incoming long-range drones with a system that costs a fraction of the incoming threat, then it is no longer simply trying to survive Russian pressure. It is trying to invert the economics of the air war at all. A $2,000 interceptor against a platform that costs 10 or even 20 times as much changes completely planning assumptions, procurement choices, and alliance conversations. But here's the catch. Technology only matters politically when it can be scaled, funded, and integrated. Reuters knows that these systems are being bought through the government's defense tech incubator and also through prominent private charities. That tells us something important about the Ukrainian model. It is part state, part civic mobilization, part emergency wartime startup culture. Training is also relatively fast for these drones. Reuters says that if you already know how to fly an FPV drone, moving to this kind of device takes only 2 to 4 days adaptation. Then comes the wider political twist. AP reports that Ukraine has become one of the world's leading producers of high-tech, battle-tested drone interceptors, and that Ukrainian teams recently visited Gulf countries to discuss mutual interests. British then officials believe that Russia and Iran are also collaborating on drone technology and tactics in the Middle East. In other words, Ukraine's drone experience is no longer just about defending Ukrainian skies. It is becoming an exportable strategic asset. And that leads us directly into the next chapter, because once Ukraine's battlefield experience becomes valuable abroad, diplomacy around Ukraine itself changes too. If you think this was just another friendly visit and a few photo opportunities, wait until you hear what was underneath it. AP reports that Volodymyr Zelenskyy met Keir Starmer in London at a moment when the Iran war had revived Russia's declining core economy through higher oil revenues, when it robbed the US brokered Russia-Ukraine talks of momentum, and when could soon limit Kyiv's access to Western air defense systems needed in the Middle East. That is the real strategic problem, and Starmer put it very clearly. AP quotes him saying, "We cannot lose focus on what is going on in Ukraine and the need for our support." He also said Vladimir Putin cannot be the one who benefits from the conflict in Iran, whether that means higher oil prices or weaker sanctions. That is why the London visit mattered. It was not just about solidarity. It was about preventing destruction itself from becoming a weapon. There is also a direct link to the previous chapter. AP says Starmer's office announced that the United Kingdom and Ukraine will sign a deal combining Ukraine's expertise and Britain's industrial base to manufacture and supply drones and innovative capabilities. Britain will also fund the AI Center of Excellence with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And that suggests Europe is no longer thinking only about helping Ukraine absorb pressure. It is also thinking about integrating Ukraine into a broader European defense technology ecosystem. Then comes the macroeconomic warning. Finland's President Alexander Stubb said at Chatham House that the Iran war is bad for Ukraine mainly because oil prices feed the Russian war machine. He added that Russia's economy had been doing extremely badly a couple of weeks earlier, but it is now bouncing back. That is the key point. A shift in one theater changes the war economy in another. But that's only half the story. Because even as leaders say the right things in London, Europe's unity is being tested elsewhere in a far more practical way. Now here's where things get tricky. On paper, the Druzhba pipeline story sounds technical. In reality, it is one of the clearest examples of how energy, sanctions, infrastructure damage, and European political leverage are all colliding together. Reuters reports that Ukraine accepted the Europeans' offer for technical support and funding to restore flows through this damaged Druzhba pipeline, but also signaled that Russian crude deliveries to Hungary and Slovakia are still weeks away. Zelenskyy said repair work was nearing completion and that the pumping station could be restored in about 1.5 months, assuming there are no further Russian attacks. And that alone would matter, because the politics around it are what makes the whole story explosive. Reuters says Hungary and Slovakia have been cut off from Russian oil deliveries via Druzhba since late January, after Kyiv said that a Russian strike damaged pipeline equipment in western Ukraine. Hungary and Slovakia, however, have accused Kyiv of delaying the restart and repairs. Then comes the leverage play. Reuters reports that Hungary has continued blocking a €90 billion loan from the European Union for Ukraine, as well as new sanctions on Russia, for as long as flows via Druzhba pipeline remain suspended. By the way, interesting fact, Druzhba in Russian is friendship. So yeah, Viktor Orban reportedly put it in brutally simple terms. If there is no oil, there is no money. This is what changed the story. The pipeline is no longer just infrastructure. It is a bargaining chip in a wider struggle over who gets to define European solidarity. Ukraine is saying the line will be restored, but repairs take time and more Russian strikes remain possible. Hungary is saying that until oil flows return, it will use its veto power to squeeze concessions and slow broader European Union action. And once you see that, the next chapter almost writes itself. Because the Druzhba fight is not an isolated energy dispute. It is a part of a wider European argument over whether the continent is really done with Russia's energy model. There is a twist here that most people miss. Europe's debates about Russia never disappeared. They just went quieter for a while under wartime pressure. Reuters reports that European foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas pushed back against Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever's suggestion that relations with Moscow should be normalized and that Europe should regain access to cheap Russian energy. Reuters says de Wever claimed other leaders agreed with him privately, but did not dare to say it publicly. Kallas rejected that, saying that she had been behind those closed doors and did not see such appetite. So, why does this all matter? Because it tells you that the next stage of the European debate may not be about whether Russia is a problem. Almost everyone in Brussels already understands that Putin remains a problem. The argument is now about cost, endurance, and what Europe is willing to live without. Cheap Russian energy was not just an economic convenience. It was part of the old equilibrium. And whenever prices rise, industries struggle, or elections tighten, the temptation to imagine to return to that old arrangement now suddenly starts to creep back. Kallas is not just arguing about one policy detail. She is drawing a line around the meaning of the war itself. If Europe starts edging back towards business as usual with Moscow, while the war remains unresolved, then every promise about deterrence, strategic independence, and long-term pressure begins to just look conditional. But that still leaves one more uncomfortable question. Even if Brussels holds the line rhetorically, what happens if other powers try to reposition themselves as hosts, brokers, or alternative diplomatic channels? That question takes us directly to Ankara, Turkey. If you're still with us, this next part matters more than just first appears. Reuters reports that Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan told Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that Turkey is ready to host the next round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Fidan said that the prolonged war possesses risks not only for regional countries, but for the international order, and then the ministers also discussed energy security. Reuters adds that the conversation included Russian-Turkish energy cooperation and specifically the protection of Blue Stream and Turk Stream. Turkey's move is strategically interesting for several reasons. First, Ankara prefers being indispensable rather than just merely aligned. Hosting talks gives Turkey relevance, leverage, and visibility. Second, Turkey sits at the intersection of Black Sea security, NATO politics, trade, grain routes, and energy transit, so it is one of the very few actors that can plausibly talk to everyone while remaining central to the real logistics. Third, by linking negotiations with energy security, Ankara is telling both Moscow and Europe that the war's diplomatic future cannot be separated from infrastructure politics. But there is also a more skeptical approach. AP reports that the US-mediated talks between Moscow and Kyiv have produced no significant progress on key issues and are now on hold because of the Middle Eastern conflict. So Turkey may be positioning for influence before there is even any real breakthrough to mediate. But still, in geopolitics, positioning does matter. Sometimes the country that puts itself in the room early is the one that shapes the agenda later. And that brings us to the final chapter. Because whenever talks move or stall, whether Europe stays united or not, and whether Ukraine keeps innovating faster than Russia, one hard limit still hands over everything. And this limit is money. Here is the most important financial number of the day. Reuters calculates that Russia's federal budget proceeds from oil and gas taxes are expected to drop by 52% in March, down to 520 billion rubles or approximately $6.4 billion, compared with the same month in 2025. Reuters also says oil and gas revenues makes up around a quarter of Russia's federal budget, and that January to March proceeds are expected to total 1.34 trillion rubles, down from 2.64 trillion rubles in the first 3 months of 2025. These are not just decorative numbers, they go straight to the sustainability of the war effort. But here is where most people go wrong. They hear the number and assume that Russia is suddenly running out of money tomorrow. That is not the right assumption. Reuters also notes that the recent jump in global oil prices caused by the US-Israeli war on Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has not yet fully fed into Russia's budget because current revenues are calculated using the previous month. Reuters says that oil prices are up roughly 40% since the conflict on February 28. So the better assumption is not that Russia is suddenly broke, is that Russia remains highly exposed to commodity swings and geopolitical shocks that can relieve pressure just as quickly as sanctions or price declines can intensify it. And this is where the whole briefing locks together. Higher oil prices help Moscow, sanctions relief helps Moscow, distracted allies help Moscow. But Ukrainian adaptation in drones hurts Moscow as well. Deep strikes into Russia hurt Moscow. Interruptions to old energy assumptions hurt Moscow. Revenue declines expose dependence. All this is just a carefully and very fragile balancing act. To sum it all up, Russia is now openly admitting that Ukrainian drone pressure has reached the point where no region feels fully safe. Ukraine's local counterattacks and drone innovation are complicating Moscow's military story. Europe is trying to keep attention on Ukraine, even as the Iran war lifts oil prices and shifts strategic bandwidth. And the real struggle is spreading far beyond the front into sanctions, pipelines, diplomacy, and war finance. Guys, if you want more daily briefings in this exact format, with the battlefield, geopolitics, economy, sanctions, technology, diplomacy, and domestic Russia all tied together into one coherent picture, please consider subscribing to my channel and stay tuned. because the next few days may tell us whether this was just another busy news cycle or the beginning of a more dangerous new phase. Don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you tomorrow.
To sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.